Hello and welcome to Stand With Us Connect. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are around the world. It's great to connect with you. I'm Ilana Sherrington-Hoffman, and we're coming to you live from Israel with another Stand With Us Connect session, our brand new webinar series. Stand With Us has been at the forefront of getting Israel education to people from all around the world in multiple languages, and even during these challenging times, we wanted to make sure that we can still bring Israel to you. Today's special session is with an organization that literally brings Israel around the world and really is a source of pride and joy to Israelis. We are excited to host Rachel Wallace, who's the Director of Outreach and Engagement at IsraAID, Israel's largest humanitarian aid organization. Rachel oversees IsraAID's community and university partnerships, programs, events, and she directs IsraAID's humanitarian fellowship. She brings to the role her background in nonprofits, interfaith and international relations, and young professional and youth leadership development. Rachel, it is an absolute pleasure and a privilege to hear from you today. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. And it's honestly such a pleasure to be here too. From what I've seen, Stand With Us offers such incredible webinars, brings so many creative ways for the community to engage with Israel. And honestly, at IsraAID, we're honored to be part of this platform. So thank you for having us on.
It's our absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to learning more about IsraAID together with all of our followers tonight. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about the organization. We're going to start at the very, very beginning. Every organization has a story. So what I would like for you to do is tell us the story of IsraAID.
Sure. To start at the very beginning, first of all, IsraAID, as you mentioned, Israel's largest humanitarian aid organization. So anytime you hear, for example, that Israel is the first on the ground, let's say after a big natural disaster, tsunami, earthquake, volcano, etc., or after a pandemic, refugee crisis, etc., most of the time, that's IsraAID. We were founded in 2001 by very idealistic Israelis who felt like they had something to contribute to the world. And of course, we're motivated by the values of our people and our nation when we see catastrophes taking place all over the world, not to sit silently, knowing that as Israelis, we have very creative and unique expertise that's developed out of Israel and a stable nation. So we're in a position where we can dispense that expertise to communities all over the world. And initially, actually, we started in 2001 more as an umbrella organization with several different Jewish and Israeli organizations as a whole. And 2010 is really when we transitioned to focus more on long-term deployments, not only addressing immediate needs of populations, but also focused on the long term. So for example, in 2010, we responded to the earthquake in Haiti. Depending on the source, depending on who you talk to, that was an incredibly tragic earthquake, took the lives of 200,000 to 300,000 people. We were there for about 7 years. And that's very indicative of our work all over the world. It's very common that we stay easily 1, 2, 5, 7, sometimes even up to 10 years. And with IsraAID, when you think of us, think of the abbreviation FILO for first in, last out, because most of the time we're not only the first on the scene after a disaster, but also the last to leave, because that's really what makes our work sustainable and helps us work in partnership with communities to rebuild and become even stronger.
Fantastic. What I'd like to ask you about, you mentioned, of course, Israelis and Israeli know-how and how that is being used in order to support these different communities. But before we actually get to anything technological or equipment or innovations, I want to talk a little bit about the Israeli spirit. What is it, do you think, about IsraAID being an Israeli organization and being composed of Israelis that makes it unique? What makes them be the ones that want to get out there in the world and try to make it a little bit of a better place?
That's an excellent question. And I'd actually like to quote Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs when he spoke on a previous Stand With Us Connect webinar. And I quote, because I love this quote because he nails it so perfectly about the Israeli spirit and the Israeli ethos that really embodies IsraAID as well. And he said, quote, "Every time there is a threat, Israel has found a solution to turn that curse into a blessing. Israel shows us that you can be surrounded by enemies, be a tiny country surrounded by stretches of land, and yet you can still affirm life. And again, I love this quote because it's so applicable to Israelis and to IsraAID. For example, one key area of expertise that we bring to communities all over the world is in the mental health and the mental trauma area. And we all know, right, on this webinar that Israel faces terror attacks from all sides and from all angles. And as a result, Israelis and Israel as a nation has become very resilient and has developed a very unique set of expertise in the mental health arena because it's had to. And it's also a very Israeli attitude to, in a way, turn that negative into a positive. In other words, to think, okay, this is a really traumatic, difficult situation, but at the same time, we're able to build from it and develop this unique expertise, and we can give it to the world. We can work in partnership with communities worldwide to help them build back after a really difficult disaster. And it's not only coming from an empathy point of view, but Israelis, and again, I think this is why IsraAID in part stands out among several humanitarian aid organizations, is because as an Israeli organization, we really understand the correlation between a physical disaster and the mental health impact that it has on a community. The correlation, that's often invisible. It's not often obvious that a community psyche can be really impacted by an earthquake, a tsunami, that a physical destruction like the destruction of a school, a community center, et cetera, it's very obvious, it's apparent, we see it. But the mental health impact, not always as much. But at IsraAID, in part because we're Israeli, we really understand that correlation and we can provide that expertise. And that's in many respects our special sauce, if you will.
That's absolutely beautiful. That's really a very special way to describe Israelis in general, and to describe how the fact that IsraAID is an Israeli organization is really making a difference, and how they really want to make the world a better place because of the experiences and the mentality and the spirit of the Israeli people. I do want to talk a little bit about the technology, the innovation, the know-how, the medical experience. Can you tell us a little bit about what the different things that IsraAID uses in its humanitarian aid and support in terms of that know-how?
Absolutely. As we all know, Israel is at the forefront of so many incredible areas, whether that's in the mental health and trauma, as I just described a little bit, the medical, the water, or as we like to say, WASH, for water, sanitation, and hygiene. And we've been able to bring that expertise all over the world. And there are many examples. One I'll give is actually in Puerto Rico. IsraAID has been in Puerto Rico since minute one, either the first organization on scene, actually following Hurricane Maria. And one of our projects there was to install what we call a gravity-based water filtration system. I know that's really a mouthful, but essentially it's a water filter system. It's gravity-based, it's not electric. And when we installed it, it was actually the first time the community that we were working with in Puerto Rico had access to safe water. And in the meantime, as we were building this, we also installed home-based water filtration systems in various homes of the community. And also something I'll add to this story is that we always engage the community in how to work these models. It happens all the time in humanitarian aid that sometimes communities all over the world will receive physical items or they'll receive the pieces of the technology, but they don't know how to use it. And so it's not a useful tool to them. But for us, we always engage, we always educate. Within all of our projects, we're very entrenched within the community. And in addition to the expertise, I mentioned before, it's a partnership. We're always working side by side with the community, and that's also a big part of our success.
That's absolutely fantastic. If you think about it, a lot of Israel's challenges are things that it can be helpful to the world. Things like, for instance, you spoke about the about the water situation. Israel is, you know, a lot of desert land. So for us to have all these innovations because of the realities that Israelis live in, and then be able to also export that to help other communities is a beautiful thing. And you are the ones to make that happen. I also want to talk about the staff and the people, because that's something that's very, very unique, because you're a fantastic representation of what I would call the Israeli society. Israelis are a multicultural society. We have lots of different cultures and populations. And from what I understand, IsraAID is the same. You have staff members from all different populations and backgrounds and cultures. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's like, what that looks like?
That's also such an excellent question. And I'm very proud to talk about this as an American representing an Israeli organization in the States, is that we really embody almost every incredible quality about Israel. And one quality, for example, is the diversity of our staff, as you so beautifully mentioned. First of all, we've had, so many diverse Israelis working with us. Some examples include, for example, in Greece and Germany, we've had Israeli Jews, we've had Israeli Arab Muslims, Israeli Arab Christians, Druze working on our team. Or another example is in Guatemala. Our country director there now is totally Israeli, but initially comes from Argentina. And so that's also another way we're successful, is because we truly embrace the diversity of Israel and intentionally deploy people that have many similar, either a similar language or a similar cultural background. And that's also a key to our success, is because in humanitarian aid in general, it's very important to understand where the community is coming from, to be able to communicate with them, understand where they are culturally, socially, economically, psychosocially, and having that common connection is very helpful. And I'll also add, in addition to our teams that we bring in outside, and most of the time from Israel, about 80% of our staff is actually local all over the world. And that's also intentional, because that's also how we know where the community's at and what their needs are. It's by working with the locals and entrenching ourselves within the local community. And that's also key. And frankly, our work is not about IsraAID. It's not about our name. It's not about our ego. It's really about the people with which we're working. And involving them in the projects and bringing them and working with them as part of the team is also empowering to them. And that's very key and crucial to our work.
And do the communities that IsraAID helps know that IsraAID is an Israeli organization?
That's also a very good question. So it's a little bit hard to see. I have one of our IsraAID shirts. So majority of the time when we do deploy somewhere, we come in wearing a shirt that says IsraAID. Obviously, IsraAID sounds like Israel. Our logo currently looks very similarly to what an Israeli flag looks like. So often people know, they figure it out, they make a connection. But this is majority of the time, and it's very, and I think one reason why we're effective is because it's very sincere. We're driven by the values of our nation and our people, and we're able, in many respects, to build bridges in that way too. There are some exceptions where we don't go in wearing this shirt and where communities don't know that we come from an Israeli organization. Believe it or not, this is very surprising to a lot of people, but we've actually worked in some nations that don't have diplomatic ties with Israel. And, again, that's because we've been invited. We have a stellar reputation in the humanitarian aid world. People know us for our expertise. And there have been times where, because of that, we've been invited to different countries such as Iraq and Indonesia, that don't have ties. And so we don't wear the shirt. We go in undercover, almost as if we're a member of another partner organization on the ground. And again, because it's not about Israel, it's not about our ego, it's not about the flashy title of our organization. And frankly, we work with all sorts of communities, populations, regardless of their race, ethnicity, national background, religion, because for us, that doesn't matter. What's important is that we have a very unique and skillful set of Israeli expertise that we can give, and we give it.
It's an incredible thing to imagine you going to countries that either are without diplomatic relations to Israel or maybe even hostile to Israel and still going there just because you want to provide that aid. I do want to talk about the countries that you do show yourselves, you represent Israel in them, because there's something interesting about the fact that it's not an official channel. This is not a governmental kind of relationship. This is sort of very grassroots and very on the ground, working with the communities. How would you say IsraAID is able to better represent Israel to people who have probably never met an Israeli before?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first, I'll take a step back. I'll mention that we are currently in 15 countries across the globe. Since our founding, we've been in 52. So we've been around. Currently in countries from Greece to Mozambique, South Sudan. We're actually now in Israel, which I can talk about our very first project in Israel, responding to COVID-19. We're currently in Puerto Rico, also now in the US, responding to COVID-19, which I'll discuss too. And in terms of, our relationship building in the field, it happens, I think, because it's very genuine and it's very sincere. And as an Israeli staff team, we're able to come in, I think, with an empathy, because Israelis have also faced their own sorts of disasters and crises, although they may be a different type, a different form, but they come in with, first of all, a sincere empathy. I think also our approach that we work side by side with people. It's not us coming in for a short time, telling people what to do, and then getting the heck out of there. It's very long term. It's very sincere. It's very much we take a community approach. A lot of it is about relationship building, and there are several examples. So I'll highlight a few of them for the sake of time. One is, you heard me mention earlier, we work in Greece. We've been there since 2015 in Lesbos and in Thessaloniki. At first, actually, when we first deployed to Lesbos, we had a medical team. It was a very diverse team, also Israeli Jewish and Arab. And we were working with a lot of Syrians that were, coming onto shore. That was the time where there were thousands of people fleeing Syria. And our CEO loves to tell this story. I love to tell it too. One of the boats capsized, and our CEO at the time, Yotam Politzer, pulled a Syrian girl out of the water and he brought her to shore. And her father said to Yotam, I am so moved. I was taught to hate you back at home, and yet here you are helping my family, helping my community, and my government back at home in Syria is chasing us away. So it's amazing. I mean, that really our first priority, of course, is the aid. It's helping people, and through that we are able to build connections between Israelis and other communities that may or may not have encountered Jews or Israelis before, may know nothing about us. Another example that I'll provide is, actually, we were in Sierra Leone for a number of years also. At first, we were responding to Ebola. And eventually, when the country was declared Ebola-free, we were responding to mudslides there and working with very vulnerable populations. In 2018, we were awarded the International NGO of the Year in Sierra Leone. And our work there resulted in the first ever trip from a Sierra Leonean president to Israel. So that's another very proud moment, that our as you were saying, you know, our grassroots interactions, our one-on-one interactions through humanitarian aid resulting into something so positive with Israel as well.
That's an incredible thing. At Stand With Us, we're an Israel education organization, and what we really speak about is the people-to-people connection, which is something vastly different to any governmental or diplomatic ties, and it really can make a difference on the ground. And being able to see how IsraAID is actually implementing that and reaching out to communities, and just because of the joint work and that relationship and the work on the ground and the being together and seeing the other person, the other side, where you wouldn't necessarily be able to encounter them in a normal circumstances. I think that's just such a beautiful thing. And it's amazing to hear you talk about that. Your examples were really moving, and hopefully this will be something that will catch more and more, because when you encounter people and you have dialogue and you have that conversation, that's really where things start to change in terms of perception. I would love to ask you if, for instance, something unfortunately happens as a crisis around the world, what does it look like? How does IsraAID then jump into action?
Good question. You know, so I mentioned a little bit before, most of the time we are the first on scene and also the last to leave. So we not only address immediate needs, but also long-term. And in terms of jumping into action, you know, it's interesting. Often we can be the first on scene because we often will have staff deployed somewhere else, somewhat nearby. So for example, in Puerto Rico, I mentioned we were the first, and it's because actually our staff at the time came from Haiti. So that's one example. But in terms of jumping into action, you know, we generally send teams out pretty quickly, easily within, you know, the first week, even sometimes the day after, if possible. And our very first step on the ground generally is what we call a needs assessment, literally figuring out the scene, you know, if our expertise is a match for what's needed on the ground, getting a sense of the landscape of community groups and organizations and other potential partners for us to work with. By the way, we don't implement any project in the field unless we have a local partner intentionally. And so it's really a matter of learning from the community where we're best needed, what's the best fit. And generally with our approach, we often try to fill in gaps. So that might be, for example, a gap in a project or a gap in a type of expertise, or it might be a gap location-wise. So for example, you know, often what happens after a big disaster is that one humanitarian organization will go somewhere, and then all the other organizations say, okay, well, if that organization is over there, then that must mean that's where we need to be. That must mean that's where all the help is needed. But we try to think, okay, where is the help lacking? Where are organizations lacking? And so we'll intentionally try to go to that area. And we're often in some of the most remote areas in the country, working with some of the most vulnerable populations that nobody knows about, sometimes working in nations that people don't even, they really don't even know about, to be honest. For example, you know, I often tell people that we're working in Dominica. We responded to Dominica Hurricane Maria in 2017, still there. And when I tell people about this, they often say, you mean Dominican Republic? Which is fine, you know, but it's point being is that we're in areas that people don't even know about, you know, at least from an American point of view, the news doesn't cover it. Nobody knows about these disasters or these crises that are happening in certain parts of the world. And the populations are often so moved that an Israeli organization is there and remembers them and is responding.
That sounds like a really important factor, going to the places where it's most needed and not where it's most televised or known about. And you also mentioned the partnerships on the ground that are very important for you to form, that you need to have that partner in order to be active. Is there anything else that you look at in terms of where you're able to go and where you decide to launch that aid to?
Anything else we look at? I mean, that's really a a lot of it. That's a lot of what we focus on. Is that we're, I'll say again, is that it's very much based on community needs and what's important. Actually, it's interesting. We have these conversations often with so many groups about, and we ask people, what do you think is the very first step that IsraAID takes on the ground when it deploys? And people come up with sometimes the most brilliant answers, install this or install, I can't even tell you. And often, and really the first step is to talk to the locals and figure out what they need and figure out how we can be supportive to them and work in partnership with them.
Fantastic. And I want to talk a little bit about the projects that you have going on right now. Can you tell us where IsraAID is active, what you have right now in the world?
Sure. We're currently in 15 countries, from Puerto Rico to Greece, Germany, South Sudan, Mozambique, Bahamas, now in Israel. Really so many diverse countries and places. And our projects really vary, anywhere from, and I can talk about COVID-19 a little bit because we've had to get creative and shift many of them. But broadly speaking, we've, for example, run a lot of projects that were focused on therapeutic techniques, a lot of art therapy and creative therapies like that. For example, we ran those programs for a lot of refugee communities in Greece and Germany, a lot of youth empowerment programs, also a lot of programs, working with schools and working with communities to prepare them to become more resilient for earthquakes and other sorts of disasters. Often one of the first steps, for example, on the ground is either medical support. So we send teams of doctors very quickly, or often search and rescue. So for example, in Nepal, actually, we literally had teams, when we responded in 2015, there was a massive earthquake there. We were literally pulling people out from under buildings. And we pulled out actually somebody who was literally collapsed under a building. She was there for 5 days, crazy, without food, without water. So, the search and rescue expertise is also something that Israelis are very adept at providing. I mentioned also a little bit about our creative therapies like art and drama therapy. Nepal is a good example. And I'll mention also is that our programs evolve as the needs of the populations change. So we're very long-term. And Nepal, we actually, there was a point where we were providing a lot of drama therapy and other sorts of creative therapy. Nepal has a very high suicide rate, and the earthquake only exacerbated it. And it's not always easy to come in and conduct therapy in our traditional sense of what I'll say from an American perspective, what we know of it to be. So we introduced a lot of drama therapy, and that was a great way for community members to be able to express themselves and speak what was on their mind in a creative way. So a lot of diverse projects, a lot of different projects in the field.
That sounds not an easy operation to run, but also incredible that you have such a listening ear to what the community needs and not just coming and trying to enforce your own solutions. You mentioned this a little bit before about the fact that you're the last out and that you really listen to the community's needs. And I want to talk to you a bit about that, because there has been criticism in the past in general of the humanitarian aid field, saying that the organization or whatever it is comes in and supports and provides different solutions, but then leaves the community without their ability to sustain those solutions and be able to continue with that work and make sure that they're not just left stranded after the aid has gone. So how does IsraAID ensure a lasting impact and to make sure that the community can still thrive even after you've decided that it's time to wrap up the projects?
Yeah, that's a very good question. there isn't always a simple formulaic black and white answer to these things in humanitarian aid. But really, for the most part, we stay long term. We don't want to be an ever-present organization. And when we feel like, the community has gotten a hold of the types of tools and expertise we can provide, that's generally when we will, where we'll leave. And I'll mention here actually is that one of our approaches is, as we like to say, help the helpers or train the trainers. And so it's strategic. It's working with, community leaders at the top, so we can work with them and train them, and they in turn can give and dispense a lot of these types of expertise and tools to their broader community. There are a lot of examples like that. I mean, that was the case in Guatemala. We were working with a lot of community health professionals who were at the front lines after the volcano there. That's also our approach when it comes to COVID-19. We're working with frontline healthcare workers in China and in Italy and in South Korea. So we're strategic about our approach in the first place. But yeah, I mean, generally after a certain number of years, we'll eventually leave, because we don't want to be an ever-present organization.
Understood. I want to bring us to current times. And as you said, COVID-19, I'm sure that has also had an impact on IsraAID and the way that you operate, because you cannot physically perhaps get to the places that you were able to before. How has that changed your operations?
Yeah, very good question. I recently have heard from our CEO, a lot of our staff on the ground. This has been easily one of the most challenging crises that the organization has had to cope with. And so we had to think very creatively how we can provide our expertise, how we can respond, what we can do. First of all, I'll say, we've introduced some quote unquote new projects. And I put it in quotes because a lot of the people that we're working with in different countries, we were previously in those countries. So we've had relationships already with certain organizations or community groups or people on the ground. So one example now during COVID-19, we've been providing a lot of psychosocial support, a lot of stress management and capacity building workshops and sessions to people who are frontline healthcare workers. And we've been providing these sessions virtually. And, again, it's intentional. Those are the people on the front lines. Those are the people working with the masses. And, we often don't think about those people. We often think about the masses, but sometimes forget the people who are really providing the services. So at IsraAID, we make sure that they are cared for too. So that's one example. Also, I'm sure you can imagine we have projects all over the world, and we've had to get creative in how we shift our programs to accommodate the COVID-19 situation. And there have really been quite a few ways we've been doing that. One is, I mentioned a lot of our mental health expertise. We're still applying that. And actually, I'll mention Stand With Us has been such an incredible partner in helping us promote a webinar that we've been offering in the States and really around the world, called 12 Ways to Reduce Stress and Anxiety. And it's been very helpful, very beneficial for people who are really looking for techniques to be able to cope with the stress and anxiety of COVID-19. We've also been able to transition some of our projects to be online. For example, in Greece, we were running a center there that provided vocational services and programs for refugees, English classes, Greek classes, a lot of cultural awareness classes. We've been shifting a lot of those programs to be online. Also, I'll mention, we were operating in Greece, in Lesbos, we were operating a kindergarten for refugee children. And this was such an important resource in school to the parents, and we also involve them, of course, and a lot of our staff actually for that school were trained refugees that IsraAID brought on, intentionally, by the way. And, you know, obviously we've had to shut down in-person operations, but we're still working with the community to provide educational materials, kits, supplies, etc., to try to keep as normal of a schedule as possible for them. And also, you know, we like to say, even, you know, from a perspective as an American, there's an infodemic really around COVID-19. There's so much misinformation, so many questions about what's going on, questions about the virus. And so with IsraAID, because we've developed such tight relationships with community groups, we're very trusted. And we want to work with them to bring accurate information, and to also incorporate a lot of hygiene awareness and water awareness into our programs, whether those are programs with schools or community groups, etc. So really a lot there.
So in a way, the COVID-19 situation has changed your operations, but also has provided a lot of new challenges that you've had to meet, and to be able to support different communities and translate things that are relevant. And I understand you've been working a lot in Asia to provide that healthcare and that mental relief that you discussed before. So that's absolutely an incredible pivot and a huge challenge for your organization to do. And it's amazing to see how you've risen to that challenge. Would you say that the COVID-19 situation is something that has introduced new ways for IsraAID to be active around the world? Do you think there are going to be changes to the operations of the organization post-COVID-19?
You know, it's a good question. We'll see. I mean, I don't have all the answers right now in terms of what the future holds. But I think this is something that is affecting our communities that we work with for the long run, just like it is affecting all of us all over the world. And also something that I'll mention, first of all, you reminded me, is that we've been working to translate a lot of World Health Organization materials, primarily in Greece, to Farsi and Arabic, because those are the languages of the populations that we work with. And so there have been a couple of shifts currently. We're actually now working both in the US and also in Israel. In the US, actually, we're looking for volunteers. You know, people here have been hit very economically hard by COVID-19. And so IsraAID right away mobilized volunteers in LA, Orange County, San Diego, the Peninsula area, in Northern California, New Jersey, soon to be New York, to help sort and assemble food and other sorts of vital supplies. So we're looking for volunteers for that, and that was a new project that sprung into action. Also, we opened our first operation in Israel, believe it or not. Normally we work outside of Israel, but we've been working actually in South Tel Aviv with a lot of the migrant communities there that have been particularly hit hard, and many of them, you know, have been previously in either the hotel business, the restaurant business, something like that. So we've been providing resilient kits to a lot of those families over there too. So that was definitely a shift in many respects in our work in opening those projects.
Okay, it's so great to get this insight and to really learn the inner workings of what IsraAID is up to. And I also want to share with you that a lot of people are tuning in from around the world to listen to your update about this and your briefing. And I want to tell you a little bit about the countries that have been saying hello. So just so you know, we've had people tuning in from Croatia, from Italy, from the UK, from Indonesia, from the Netherlands, from Spain, from Canada, from the US, of course, from Israel. So we really have an international audience that is listening to what you have to say and to the incredible work that IsraAID provides around the world. I think it's time now to let the audience ask a little bit of questions of their own, because there's quite a lot of engagement, a lot of incredibly positive comments thanking you for your work, and some questions of inquiry about things that people would love to know about the organization. So first, I'd like to ask you, this is a question by David, and he asks, what is the source of your funding and what long-term plans do you have to sustain those funding sources?
That's an excellent question. And first, I want to acknowledge and thank everybody for tuning in today. It's really such a privilege and a pleasure. I know that because I'm here representing the organization, the thanks are coming to me. But I'd like to shift them, of course, to our staff and volunteers all over the world who are really on the front lines right now, making this incredible impact and making a difference. That being said, very good question about the funding. So our sources are a combination. We get a lot of, for example, private donations, individual donors. We've gotten some from foundations, some from other community organizations, some from government. So for example, we've received a lot from the German government. In the past, we've received a lot from the Japanese. And believe it or not, the United Nations. I'll say that again. We've received a lot of support from the United Nations, which is a shock for most of our community because we know how Israel is perceived in the UN. But at the end of the day, IsraAID is incredibly professional. Our staff does, is very impactful, makes a very big difference in the field. And so we receive a lot of funding to implement our projects all over the world. And in terms of,
so the UN recognizes IsraAID as a humanitarian aid organization that operates worldwide.
Mm-hmm. So we generally we work with, often chapters, if you will, in each country. So for example, we've received a lot of support in South Sudan, in Dominica, from various branches like the World Health Organization or UNICEF to implement our programs.
Amazing. I have an interesting question here from another David, and he says he loves the t-shirt, and where or how can we get one?
Good question. In terms of the t-shirt, thanks for that. Good question, how you can get one. Come, I don't know where you are, David, but if you come volunteer for us in the field right now, I mentioned briefly, we are really looking for volunteers now in the US because people have been hit very hard. So if you come and volunteer for us, you will get a t-shirt. And I'll mention one more thing about the volunteering is that normally the types of volunteers and staff, et cetera, that work with us in the field are professionals because we need, for example, medical expertise or we'll need a type of therapeutic expertise, et cetera. But now in the US, we're looking really for, anyone who can help, who has US citizenship, active healthcare, who feels like they're, physically able to help package and lift things. So you guys you're welcome to follow up with me after. I can put my email address in the chat box if anyone is interested in staying involved and volunteering with us right now.
Amazing. So people can be a part despite the fact that they may not be in Israel, or maybe they're working from their local communities. They can still be part of IsraAID's amazing work wherever it is that you're active right now. I have a question here from Lee, who asks, in terms of long-term impact, do you have any food or nutrition programs?
Do we have any food or nutrition programs? I mean, a lot of the first steps we take are, distributing sometimes food, water, emergency supplies. In terms of nutrition programs, so sometimes they might be incorporated into our work in and of itself. So for example, it's not, I wouldn't call this, for example, nutrition education, but in Colombia, for example, we're working with the Venezuelan refugee population. And by the way, this is a crisis that really hasn't made the news to the degree that it should have, because the number of Venezuelan refugees will even soon surpass Syrian. Really awful, awful crisis. And where we are, by the way, we're working in an area called Barranquilla. Pre-COVID-19, we were operating 2 what we call child-friendly spaces, which is really just a safe space for kids to be kids and cope. And also it's very helpful for the parents, because when their kids are in our child-friendly space, they know that they won't be pulled into any kind of drug trafficking or anything like that. And we've been providing those kids with meals. And those were some of the only, in many cases, many of those kids, that was the only source of food that they were receiving. And it was important for us that those meals were nutritious. And we brought in, of course, those who were preparing the food are also from the community, they're locals. And that was very important for us. And even now, since COVID-19 struck, we're still working with the community to make sure they do get those meals. So sometimes it can be incorporated into our work.
Fantastic. I have a question from Ayanla. Has IsraAID reached the Horn of Africa?
So we've been, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of some of the African nations that we've been in. We're currently in Mozambique, in South Sudan, Uganda, to name a few. We've been in Sierra Leone, and honestly, several other projects all over the world since we've been founded. If there's a specific country or project you're thinking of, you can write it in the chat box, and I can provide further info perhaps if we've been there.
I'm getting a question here from Howard, who asks, why doesn't your work get more press?
Why doesn't our work get more press? So I have I guess you could say 2-3-part answer to that question. First of all, it does get some. For example, again, I'm in Los Angeles, and there was just a Jewish Journal article that published our volunteering efforts locally in the US. But in terms of more press, obviously, and more publicity in general, of course, we would love that. And, I think I'm preaching to the choir when I say on this call that we need the world to know that Israelis are making this kind of impact in the world, but it doesn't magically happen. We need the support of individuals, of partner organizations to work with us to bring that platform so we can actually present about it and speak about it and raise awareness for what we're doing. So that's an ask, if those listening know of a platform that would be interested in promoting more of what IsraAID is doing and the impact that Israeli expertise is actually making all over the world, we'd love to work with you after this. And of course, that's why Stand With Us is such a valuable partner for us. It's because it's really such an incredible partner to be able to highlight this impact that IsraAID is making all over the world.
And it's our pleasure and privilege to do so. I have a question here from John Carlo. With regards to medical missions, does one need to have the license in the country where one would like to volunteer? For example, if I am a licensed pharmacist in the Philippines and I want to volunteer in a medical mission to maybe Africa or Israel, etc.
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't have a broad sweeping answer for you. I'm not sure specifically about the Philippines, so I don't want to give you a definite answer right here, right now. But we definitely have had doctors come to the field with us from Israel and from the US.
Okay. And Judy is asking, do you get any funding from the Israeli government?
Do you get any funding? Good question also. Majority of our funding has really come from outside sources. We've worked in partnership in the past with other sorts of Israeli organizations in the field, but if we have received from the Israeli government, it's been minimal. It's not, has nothing to do with a tense relationship or anything like that. We have a very good relationship, of course, but we've received most of our funding from other sources.
I'm getting a lot of reactions and comments of people that want to be involved, just so you know. So maybe you will be able to up the amount of volunteers that you have in the places that you mentioned that you need. So that's fantastic. I think we have time for one more question, and it's from Kelly, who is asking, what is your proudest moment about IsraAID?
Oh God, that's a great question to end on, and also very hard to pinpoint one proud moment. Honestly, I'm representing the organization in the States and internationally too in cases like this. Proudest moment, for me, I have the privilege from my vantage point of seeing all the incredible work that our teams on the ground are doing. And I'm so moved and inspired every day by what they're doing. Whether it's, in Vanuatu, we installed a water filtration system that was able to reach 900 people. Or whether it's in Greece, in Germany, working with communities that have been so moved by our work and have benefited so greatly, or whether it's in Sierra Leone, knowing that our work spurred a first ever presidential trip to Israel. Honestly, there's so many examples. It's very hard to highlight just one. But actually, it does remind me in a way of a story that perhaps I'll share, is that IsraAID was working and is working with Yazidi refugees in Greece. And the Yazidi community there was so moved and thankful for our work that actually when we deployed to Texas, believe it or not, we responded to Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And by chance, that's where a lot of the Yazidi refugees have been settled in the US, in parts of Texas. And they were so moved by what we did in Greece that they wanted to come and volunteer with IsraAID alongside us to pay it forward. And so, it's knowing that even though we're not the biggest organization, we're still able to make such an incredible impact with our beneficiaries, with people in the world, and also show the types of impact that Israeli expertise is really able to make around the world.
Well, that is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure you have many proud moments, but it was nice to get a little bit of an insight to some of them. It was a fantastic briefing, and it was really so interesting to get to see the inner workings, how IsraAID operates, and also how it really tells the story of Israel to people around the world in a very interesting, delicate, but beautiful manner. So thank you so much to Rachel for this incredible session. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. So I really want to thank you for your unique insight into IsraAID's crucial work, and really thank you for being here today for our Stand With Us Connect session.
Thank you. And I'll mention also, for anyone who does want to volunteer with us or get involved with us, work with us on various community programs for broader community or youth, we have a lot of the information on our website, IsraAID.org. We also have a stress relief website that we just released, IsraAID.org/stress relief. And I put my email in the chat box, rwallace@IsraAID.org. So please feel free to follow up. And thank you so much, Stan, with us, and Alana, for your time and for this opportunity. Really such a privilege.
It's been such a pleasure. And that's a wrap for today's live. Our next live will be the Forgotten Jewish Refugees from Arab Lands. And this will be hosted by our very own Roz Rothstein, who is the CEO of Stand With Us. And to you, our viewers around the world, thank you for joining us today for Stand With Us Connect. You can view our full program always on standwithusconnect.com. It was a pleasure to connect with all of you tonight, because if you can't come to Israel, we will bring Israel to you. This is Ilana Sherrington Hoffman for Stand With Us Connect. Thank you, and see you all next time.